I set up an interview with a friend I know named Flip. He's been in the fandom longer than I've even been alive. He just has a more mature perspective on a lot of things in the fandom than we young people have. This interview was supposed to be longer, and I didn't make a copy of the raw files, and then I started editing it, and then when I saved it, I went back, like, it was just all messed up. But I was able to save the last portion of the interview, which deals with a lot of issues, and is pretty good on its own. So yeah, here it is.
I'm a big fan. One of the personas I have, Tanuki-san, is very much obviously by my Japanese-inspired creation, and what it's in direct reference to their raccoon dog, and that animal in their own spirituality has a tremendous mythology, and yet what's so interesting about it is, in many ways, although it has its own mythology, it was a very also insightful tool to understanding the baser aspects of male Japanese culture, which sometimes was so busy being worried about honor and station and all that, that sometimes it was nice to have this mythological creature that could be about wanting to eat, wanting to get laid, wanting to just make money and have fun and be out in the sun. And so it actually allowed a certain level of folklore alter ego saying, wouldn't it be nice to be this character? Well, yes. And it arguably had that function. And the fact is that, you know, you could argue it was the more developed society that said, oh, but we're not part of that. And kind of the thing that was the 1970s that became Funny Animal the Furry, I mean, the whole idea of these aren't just for kids, they're good for adults too, is that the use of the anthropomorphic animal to look at ourselves, to look at our base emotions, our cleverness, our insightfulness, our raw, instinctual, emotional set that is part of our being. It's a very useful tool for understanding that. And I know where people are always worried about, but why the sexual thing? The thing I always use is that thing was always there. How has that always been there? Okay, you need to talk to your kids about sex. What's the expression? What it's given usually a tagline for that. We're going to talk to our kids about the bee and the bee.
Oh, the bees and the birds and the bees.
And the funny thing is, that's a common colloquialism that furry culture didn't say, hey, everybody use this terminology. That's been a common dodge in Western culture, or at least American Western culture, for many, many, many decades prior to furry ever being around. And it's because, okay, we're talking about natural effects and things, and we're trying to be very coy about all the other complexities of human society. Well, furry's doing exactly that. It's talking about a lot of that basic stuff, just using metaphorical language, and arguably being a little more aware of it, if you will.
Mm-hmm. A little more direct. And then what do you think about just with the internet being more accessible, what are your thoughts on children being more involved in the fandom whenever you're dealing with all these themes?
I'm going to have to split this up into three answers, because there is the very real legal answer that we have, which is, we respect the rights of parents, do what is right, do all that. And at the end of the day, you still deal minors with minors. We are, in terms of like MN furs, but just even as individuals, we have a legal code. We need to try to do what we can to support that legal code. That all being said, art is art. Our music, our movies, our whatever, commonly depict scenes, scenarios, suggestions that are not always what I would call kid-friendly. Half the music out there is about love and, falling in love with a girl and all the side action that kind of can happen, or whatever your preferable partner is. So the fact is, music has it, our movies have it. The fact is, it's always pushing that boundary by definition, because, well, that's what art is. It's engaging our emotions. And to assume that a kid is nothing but, I'm going to be nice and chaste until 18 and then I can engage these things, is not always the most responsible thing. So art being art, it's already going to be, there's always those things about coming of age where, you get a hold of your brother's Playboys, or you witness your first whatever. The fact is, there's always that moment where you realize that girls are no longer icky, or boys are no longer icky, again, whatever your personal interest is. But there's a point where you realize that the world is a lot more complicated than it is, and that never waits till 18, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's not our job to say, here's how it is. But I will say this, that I know many, many people in the fandom, the same way they could have gotten a hold of, again, some of the other publications I said, but they got a hold of the furry stories, like especially a lot of kids in a very good friend of ours in the fandom right now. I know he got a hold of publications during the great coming out of the 1990s that helped him become aware of his sexuality in a way that was very meaningful to him, and it's the reason why he's still very attached to the fandom, because other than that, he would have had no idea what he liked and why he liked it. And you know what? That's important. The thing with the funny animals is it's a weird bridge, and this is where, both in terms of the legalities, but also looking at art and how it causes us to engage our emotions and grow up and all that, funny animals are nice and disarming and give us context for all the scary things in the world. The funny thing is that because they are animals and act naturally, they will do the things that, well, us as human beings, we are animals, and therefore it helps us deal with those complexities of life that we'll deal with. Anger, hostility, love, lust, all those wonderful things, even though, yes, they are kind of sometimes ugly and dangerous. But again, furry is a metaphorical language, and therefore I think it's actually in a particularly good position for making kids aware of these things. Arguably somewhat better than some other art forms, quite frankly, because it already, because of its metaphorical language, contains a certain level of context, because it's, well, natural. Mm-hmm. So on one level, I have to say, hey, our legal thing is to say, hey, we need to keep the adult stuff away from the kids. At the same time, a kid has to grow up, and art commonly challenges us in that area. So where does that put us? Well, I will say that I know of a lot of people who have grown up with furry where it helped them find their identity, and they encountered this when they were 15, 16, and 17. And it was very useful and instrumental in them becoming more balanced people now than having to wait and have all these kind of negative connotations to wait till college or even later. So take that answer as you will, that, yeah, it's an art form, which means it exposes us to a much more complicated, a much more emotional world, but it also provides context and understanding, and isn't that what growing up's all about?
Mm-hmm. And then I guess we can also tie this into the next question, is what is your take on this idea, this idea of furry becoming, quote, mainstream? And I think a lot of people have a lot of fear for that, because they look at things like children being in the fandom, and they fear that all of a sudden furry is going to turn into this, this safe for work, kid-friendly place, and, oh, you can't do that they think that it's going to get ripped away, and then, I don't know, the evil corporations are going to take over.
I'm just going to point to every other art form and say, when does this happen? Yes, let's look at movies. A lot of movies today are PG-13, but there are quite a few movies that are still successful that are R, because they realize that it can only talk to very specific things. Mad Max Fury Road, great movie, still made a lot of money. It was an R movie, and yet it had to be R in order to do the things it was going to do. There's a lot of music out there that does the same thing. I think we talked about Zootopia. Zootopia was obviously Disney. And I won't go through the full history now. The history between what is now modern furry and the Disney Corporation is a wonderfully convoluted tale. But the simple fact is Disney is definitely aware of what furry is, and has been, in a weird way, kind of a weird fight with furry for well over 3 decades, because of their artists and contributing and all that other fun stuff. Anybody who knows anything about the metaphorical language was laughing their butts off during the Oasis scene, because it was obvious, wow, we've made this thing as sexual as possible without being sexual. Hence the term lampshade hang. It was a brilliant scene because it was aware that, yeah, there's a sex issue. We can't talk about it, but we're going to acknowledge that it exists. As one of my artist friends said, it was basically Disney waving to the furries across the street. It wasn't willing to cross the street, but it knew that they were over there, and was more than willing to acknowledge their existence. It's just that mainstream is always going to try to play it safe. There's many parts of furry that's always about pushing boundaries. Its inception was about pushing boundaries back in the 70s, which means, although I think elements of using funny animals in safe and easy ways are always going to be useful and good and all that, I think there's always going to be a part about furry that's always going to be avant-garde. It's always going to be pushing limits. It's always going to be looking at the new issue. So that's why when I know when people's like, oh, it's not about sex or it's not about this, I'm like, okay, it can be though. And the moment that you say it's not, you're not being sincere, because part of furry is saying, okay, what are anthropomorphic animals good about teaching us about the human species? Well, pretty much everything. And so in that, there really is no subject that it can't touch. There isn't anything that is in some ways too taboo, quite frankly, because it's talking about base instincts and base reactions. And as long as it's in human experience to feel these things, those anthropomorphic characters are going to show it in one form or another in the media, regardless of whether or not greater society thinks it's acceptable or not. Mm-hmm. So parts of it may mainstream, just like Zootopia, but I think it's always also going to be challenging, no matter how much it tries to normalize itself.
Just because I think we can almost go back to what was mentioned earlier, that just the nature of furry itself attracts certain people, I must say.
I think the best way to say this is that society itself has we talk about the status quo. We talk about a core group of people who just think life is this way because it's always been this way, maybe the nuclear family or certain groups are in charge or whatever. And the neat use of anthropomorphic art throughout history has been talking about cultures, classes, human experiences that aren't always easy to talk about, that we're not always comfortable talking about. So we use these these metaphorical devices to talk about, oh, we're not talking about this group or this race or this issue in culture. We're actually just talking about some funny animals. And yet anybody who knows anything about reading between the lines is like, no, you're using this as a metaphor for this issue. Well, yeah, but it's not. And that's the game it's always played throughout history, even before furry arguably existed. It's just that we kind of, in the 70s, rediscovered this tool, and currently we have a subculture that runs it to the nines, and that's a good thing. So my kind of big thing about the mainstreaming is it's always going to challenge us. And art, being art, that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just the nature of things. Then what do you
exactly?
What do you see for the future of furry?
Whatever it is, it's probably going to challenge us and maybe even upset us, but that's a good thing. And it's always going to be petitioning our base emotions. So whatever is the big base emotion of the next generation, the big burning question that they need to solve or figure out about their identity or however that works, that's what furry is going to be dealing with.
Okay.
So I can't even speculate because I'm not that generation.
Mm-hmm. There's only one way to find out, and that is to wait, I guess.
Yeah. Usually I'm too far removed that I can't participate anymore, but I can maybe at least look at and appreciate, saying, oh, okay, well, they get to figure out their challenge, their issue, and maybe, hopefully, maybe not make as many mistakes as I did.
I'll leave it up. And I want to thank you very much for taking the time to do this interview with me. I know that hopefully in the future that as I will improve in these things and I'll get better in the art I want to do, you know. That's one thing I really liked about furry is that I can just I can go out there and do something and no one's going to necessarily be pointing my finger and say, oh, that's wrong, oh, that's bad. Mm-hmm. So,
all right, well, I'll leave you to the rest of the evening. I'm going to head off to dinner and I will talk to you later.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, bye.